Shalom, as everyone doing? Today's day 36 of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and we're learning Siman Seif. Let's begin. Tzoas Adam, Tzoa of a human, Afa Pish Ein Lo Reach Ra, even though it doesn't have even for whatever reason it does not have a bad smell. V'chein Tzoas Chasul or Numia, or a Tzoa of a cat or a cat-like creature. V'Tzoas Tarnagol Adumi, or a Tzoa of a Tarnagol Adumi, which let's say is a turkey. Marchikin Mehen, we distance ourselves from them. However, tzoa of other animals or wild animals or birds, generally do not have a bad smell, and we do not have to distance ourselves from them. But if they would have a bad smell, or a dead animal that has a bad smell, or anything that has a bad smell because it decayed, or a chicken coop, we distance ourselves from them. We distance ourselves from bad smelling water. Or soaking water that we soak in it, flax or hemp. These things generally do have a bad smell. And we have to distance ourselves from them just like we do from tzoa. Okay. So obviously until now we've been dealing with the halachas that one is not allowed to say Devarim Shebekdusha in the presence of tzoa. So the question really is that specifically human tzoa, or a tzoa that comes from other animals as well? So there are really two Gemaras that deal with this, both in Brachos, one's a Bavli, one's a Yerushalmi. And if you look in the Gemaras there, they both obviously say that Tzoas Adam we have to distance ourselves from, but there are other things, there are other animal tzoa, there are very specific animal tzoas that have the din of Tzoas Adam that we also distance ourselves from. For example, the Bavli gives a list, and it says one thing is tzoa of a chazir, tzoa of a pig. That's something that has the same status as tzoa of a man. And Yerushalmi in the list says tzoas hanemiya, right, which is a lot of things that Kitzur quoted, that hanemiya is a cat-like creature that would also have a din of tzoas adam. So the question is, why do most animals not have a din of tzoas adam? Why do some animals do? So Rabbeinu Yonah asked that, and he says as follows. He says, every single animal in the world, or most animals in the world, their tzoa does have a bad smell right when it leaves the animal's body. However, in hareach ra kol kach, it's not such a bad smell. Therefore, mutar likros kriyas shema kineged tzoa shalam. Therefore, you'd be able to say Shema or other Devarim Shebekdusha by their tzoa. However, for example, tzoas chasuli says, which is an example, tzoa of a cat, which is an example of a tzoa that does have a din of human tzoa. Kevan sherecha ra ma'od. That has a very bad smell. Therefore, it has a din of tzoas adam. Right. So this list that the Gemara gives is a very exact list. That these are things that have a very bad smell, so they would have a din of tzoa of an adam. However, things that are not mentioned in the list, we could assume that it might have a bad smell, but it's not so bad. So one would be able to save a Devarim Shebekdusha in front of. For example, let's say something not on the list would be tzoa of a horse. Right, so we're assuming tzoa of a horse, even though the tzoa might have kind of a bad smell, but since it's not so bad, therefore one would actually be able to say Devarim Shebekdusha by the tzoa of a horse. However, if you look in Shulchan Aruch, it's not so clear, right? Because Shulchan Aruch, right, he quotes a few things in the list that would be the same status as tzoas adam, right? This is the Shulchan Aruch in Siman and Test Seif Daled, right? For example, quotes tzoa of a chazir. That's what the Bavli says. That has a din of tzoas adam, and we'd have to separate ourselves from that. But then he says, he says obviously other animals you don't have to separate yourself from. But then he says, but if they would have a bad smell, right? If you find an animal that does have a bad smell, dinam kitzoas adam, it has the same status as tzoas adam, right? So if you find a horse and you smell that tzoa and it actually does smell bad, it actually would have a din of tzoas adam, and we would have to separate ourselves from that, even though it wasn't in the list of the Gemara. Right, and that's what Shulchan Aruch says. So the Mishnah Berurah deals with this, and he says, what's considered a bad smell? Right, like Shulchan Aruch says, if you find an animal that their tzoa has a bad smell, we have to distance ourselves from them. Okay, what's considered a bad smell? So he says, he's quoting the Kesef Mishnah, he says, Kol shedarach b'nei adam l'hitzar me'osa reach. If a normal person would be distressed by this type of smell, that is considered a bad smell, and we have to distance ourselves from that. Then he quotes the Chayyim, who clarifies, and he says, not everything that has a bad smell in the world has a din of tzoa. right? For example, let's say you find an oil that, for some reason, that oil has a very bad smell. That would not have the same status as Soas Adam. He says it's only elamash nisrach machmas ipush, right? It's only something that has a bad smell due to its decaying, right? For example, that's really what soa is. So it starts off as food, it goes into the body, it decays in the body, then it comes out, right? But it starts off with the okay smell. It starts off with a good smell, and then over time, it turns into a bad smell. But if something was created, for example, there was this oil that started off with a bad smell, that would not have a status of tzoa, and one would not have to separate himself from that. If you look in the Magen Avraham, the Magen Avraham says, not so fast. He kind of disagrees with this Shulchan Aruch, right? Because the way the Machs Shekel explains it, he points out, he's like, the Gemara in the Yeshami, the Bavli, gives an exact list. It gives an exact list of certain animals that have a din of tzoas adam. But you know what the Gemara didn't say? It didn't say any animal that their tzoa has a bad smell has a din of tzoas adam. So therefore, he doesn't like that the Shulchan Aruch really takes this Gemara l'avdafka, and kind of throws away the list, and he just says, if it has a bad smell, you separate yourself from it. So this is what the Magen Avraham clarifies, and he says, there are two stringencies when it comes to tzoas adam, right? One is, let's say you have tzoa of a human, and for whatever reason the smell dissipates, the smell goes away. It still has the status of tzoa, and one will not be able to say Dvarim Shebekdusha in the presence of it. That's one stringency. Second is, when it comes to tzoas adam, even if you move so far away that you can't smell it anymore, it would still be asur to say Dvarim Shebekdusha. For example, if it's kimlo einav, if you could still see it, even though you can't smell it, one would not be able to say Dvarim Shebekdusha. So the Magen Avraham believes, and he says that when it comes to tzoas adam, and when it comes to the list that the Bavli and the Yerushalmi gives, that has the same status as tzoas adam, those two dinim apply, right? The din of, even though it doesn't smell anymore, would still be machmir about it, and this din that when you can't even see it when you say Dvarim Shebekdusha, those stringencies would apply to both tzoas adam and the list that the Yerushalmi and the Bavli give. But any other tzoa that happens to have a bad smell, for example, let's say you have horse tzoa that has a bad smell, that would not have the same stringency, and you'd only have to go so far away that you can't smell it anymore. So, for example, if for whatever reason it loses its smell, you could say Dvarim Shebekdusha there. And two, even if you could see it but you just can't smell it, that would you would also be able to say Dvarim Shebekdusha. However, if you look in the Aruch Shulchan says we can't reject the psak of the mechaber. But if you look in the Mishmur, he says if in a bidi evid situation, if you've already davened, and we're going to see there's a halachos, if you even bidi evid, if you daven in the presence of tzoa, you might, in some certain circumstances, you actually have to repeat davening. That would not apply by these cases. Okay. There are two machmir shitos in this regard. One is one's totally not accepted, one's kind of accepted. There's a shita that the Rashba quotes, B'Shem the Ravid. He said that this whole halacha that we don't have to separate ourselves from tzoa of animals, that's only if it's yavesh. That's only if it dried out. Aval barachim, kulam asurim. But if the tzoa is still moist, one actually would have to separate from it, and it would have a din of tzoa sadam. Okay, that chumrah is not accepted, as the Rashba himself says, but that's a shita nevertheless. Second shita is, which is maybe a little more accepted, which the post can talk about, is that right, we have this whole list in the Gemara that gives a whole list of different types of animals that have the same status as tzoas adam. Right, so Rabbeinu Yonah says it's because this whole list, it smells very bad. Other tzoos don't smell as bad. But the Orchos Chaim says no, that's not the rhyme and the reason because of the list. He says the rhyme and reason is as follows. He says the reason for this whole list is because these animals, we feed them grains, right? As we said in the previous year, in the last year, that, right, when does tzoa start having the status of tzoa? When you start feeding the kid grains, because as Rashi said, the grains make the tzoa smell bad. Fine. So the Orchos Chaim says, that's the reason for the list of the Gemara. That these are all examples of animals that we feed grains. But if you would find animals that you feed grains, it would have the status of tzoas adam, right? And if you like the Pri Chadash, she says, that is very mistaber, and we should hold like the shita. But the Isha Rami Batshash, he says, let hold on a little bit. He says, if you go out to the fields, what do? We feed horses. What do we feed them? He says we feed them grains. So according to that, horses should really have the status of Tzoas Adam. It should have the status of Tzoas Adam. It should be really part of the list of the Gemara. And we would have to distance ourselves from it. And he says nobody does that. Nobody distances themselves from Tzoa of a horse, right? The same thing could be by Tzoa of a dog, right? Tzoa of a dog is not in the list of the Gemara. And, right, dog food these days, it's full of grains. So is this something we have to be careful about? And really, like many more animals, should really have the status of Tzoas Adam. So he says a couple things. And he says, there's no reason we should pass something to Sorchos Chaim if it's really against the minhag. And he says, even so, like when we feed horses these grains, it's really mixed with other stuff, so it wouldn't really have a din of grain anyway. Okay, but those are just things to think about. Okay, shkoyach.